Hello and welcome to this Plato Madison lecture on what we need to know about coronavirus vaccines. I'm Joy Cardine. I'm a Plato member and I'm a retired Wisconsin public radio talk show host. It is my pleasure to be your moderator today, and I anticipate we will have a lot of questions. So please type them in the Q&A section and I will present them to our guest speaker after his presentation. Our speaker is also a Plato member. Mike Roy has studied infectious diseases, and he has 40 years of developing vaccines for biopharmaceutical firms and federal agencies. He served 30 years with the Army, Active and Reserves, developing and applying diagnostics for infectious diseases. He taught in the Biotechnology Master's Program at UW-Madison and is the co-author of Biotechnology Operations, Principles, and Practices. Michael, thank you so much for being with us today and for offering up and organizing this very timely lecture.
Thank you for having me. And I'll do the share screen here. And we can get started. Good afternoon. What I'm going to talk about today are COVID-19 vaccines, what we know about the vaccines that are currently being used and a couple that are coming down the pipeline, and give you a little bit of background. The focus is going to be on how we go about deciding whether or not we're going to get vaccinated. And so you'll see that as a recurring theme throughout my talk. As by way of starting, I'm going to show you a drawing by a Verona first grader that was done about a month ago. Martin Luther King exercise in the first grade class. The teacher asked the children to start out a narrative called Martin Luther King Had a Dream, and then to write what their dream is. And this first grader wrote, "My dream is for coronavirus to go away." And the teacher responded, "Me too." And I think we all kind of feel that way. And the first grader did a pretty nice drawing at the top of what a coronavirus looked like. My history, my background with vaccines started when I was 8 years old, and it probably started for many of you that way. We were in a line, maybe at the local high school, a long line of children about our age with our mothers standing next to us waiting for a polio vaccine, a vaccine that was very successful to the point where we've almost eliminated polio altogether. My mother and father had made a decision that the benefit of that vaccine outweighed the risk to me. And so they put me in that line. I really didn't have a concept of risk or benefit at that time until the kid in front of me turned around with a message that had been passed down the line and told me, "Oh my gosh, they broke the needle off in some kid's arm and he passed out. And they had to pull it out with a big pair of pliers and they took him away in an ambulance." Suddenly I realized there were some risks to vaccination, along with the benefit my mother had instilled in me. By the time I turned 18, I knew I could make the decision as to whether or not I wanted to be vaccinated. And that is until I went in the Army in 1971, in which some colonel decided that I would be vaccinated again. But after that 4 years of active duty, I was able to make the decision on our own. And we all were, as adults, able to make a decision on whether or not we were going to be vaccinated for the rest of our lives. And that has continued until today. Today we have a decision in front of us. Some of us have maybe already decided one way or another, but still a lot of people still have to make the decision, do the benefits outweigh the risks, in which case I would probably get the vaccine, or do the risks outweigh the benefits? And so that's really going to be the subject. Vaccine experts do not decide whether we're going to get vaccinated. The pro-vax people like Bill Gates, who puts a lot of money into vaccination and developing vaccines and is very pro-vaccination, and the anti-vax people don't decide either. We decide. We decide for ourselves. And when we do get vaccinated, it's the result of a personal decision. Let's talk a little bit about the virus, a little bit about the vaccines that we have out there. Then we'll move on to talking about the risks and the benefits that we know exist with the vaccines that are on the market today that we may be able to receive over the next couple of months. Then we'll talk about weighing those risks and benefits, just very much as our mothers and fathers did before us, but we'll do it in a very conscious manner. And then we'll wrap up with a couple of timely subjects, such as the variants that are out there and some of these new adverse events that have popped up. So the virus, we all know, it's SARS, has these little red knobs on the surface. Those little red knobs attach to our cells, and they cause infection when we come in contact with a virus. The disease really surprised us. This really snuck up on us because to date, coronaviruses have either been very mild, self-limited infections, kind of a cold type of infection, or in the case of SARS-1 in MERS, they just kind of disappeared into the sunset after there were small outbreaks. This coronavirus, SARS-2, infects the upper respiratory tract, and then it can move into the lungs and cause serious disease. And so physicians recognize three patterns of disease or symptoms that occur. There's an acute infection, and acute infections cause kind of a flu or a cold-like symptoms, upper respiratory tract. We've heard a lot about that. However, in some people, particularly people over 60 years old and people with predisposing medical conditions, it causes post-acute hyperinflammatory illness. That is, it moves into the lungs and it can cause some severe disease in the lungs, as well as gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, and even neurological and muscular symptoms. These can be life-threatening, and in fact, I think it's over 400,000 people today have died. Some people get late sequelae, that is, late odd symptoms or disease. We don't understand the pathophysiology of this very well, but it can affect the cardiovascular system. And these people that get late sequelae don't necessarily have to have this post-acute. When the SARS first popped up, we tried 4 approaches almost simultaneously. But the first one that was in the news most was intensive care of people who had this severe disease. And the intensivists, pulmonologists, put together some programs and did some very unique things that saved a lot of lives or reduced the morbidity, the time in hospital. They did little things like turning people on their stomach, selecting a better time to put people on ventilators or so forth. But it really has not reduced the mortality a lot. It works in individual cases, but not all cases. At about the same time, we went to masking, washing hands, distancing. All those things we're very used to now and we think are part of life. And this probably reduced the transmission of the disease and therefore the infection. It therefore reduced the disease. But again, it's not in any way control the outbreak to the extent that we would like. Other things that have been tried are are antiviral agents, various things to control both the virus and the inflammation that results from the viral infection. Some of these approaches were failures, like hydroxychloroquine. Others have worked to a limited extent, like dexamethasone in very seriously ill patients. Others are in the pipeline. Antivirals have not worked very well. One antiviral called remdesivir has had some effect. But overall, there hasn't been a lot of success to date from therapeutic drugs. Nor has there been a lot of success from prophylactic drugs. Some of them look promising. However, using them in a large population of people is going to be economically difficult and just not feasible from the standpoint of getting the drugs. So we turned to vaccines very early in this pandemic, and vaccines to COVID were developed unusually rapidly. You can see vaccine timelines from 1880 on of a few selected vaccines. And you can see how long it takes to develop a vaccine. Also, the other point that isn't shown in this slide is that vaccines very often fail. The failure rate in vaccine development is very high. Probably 9 out of 10 vaccines fail. In the case of SARS, you can see in the lower right-hand corner how rapidly vaccines to SARS were developed. In addition to that, there have been a lot of successes. Instead of a 90% failure rate, there's been a 90% success rate to date. These vaccines all focus on the fact that we want to develop neutralizing antibodies in people. Neutralizing antibodies have been used in the case of other vaccines. What we do is we try to put part of the virus into people in a vaccine, develop what are called neutralizing antibodies in the host and the person that's vaccinated. And we know that neutralizing antibodies can both prevent, as you see on the left-hand side of this slide, can prevent entry of the virus into the cells, the target cells, and therefore abort infection. And by coating the virus particles shown here in green, our white blood cells will ingest them like Pac-Man and destroy them. So we not only prevent the virus from attaching, but we also encourage our cells to take up and destroy those viral particles. So that is where everybody in the vaccine world has been aiming. And as you'll see in the next few slides, there's been quite a bit of success on that front. Two COVID vaccines have been developed and have been licensed by FDA under emergency use. One is from Pfizer and the other is Moderna. So let's go through and see exactly what these vaccines have done, what we learned from clinical trials. So starting in the summer of last year, large clinical trials were conducted on both of these vaccines. Talk first about the Pfizer vaccine. They enrolled 43,000 participants. Each one got 30 micrograms of the active vaccine in a 0.5 milliliter dose. 0.5 milliliter dose is equivalent to about 10 eyedropper drops of liquid. 66% of these people had what we call reactogenicity. They had one or more limited local reactions and after dose 2. Generally, with vaccines, we see fewer reactions after dose 1 than we see after dose 2, but it really varies from individual to individual. And depending on the systemic reaction, 1 to 51% had limited systemic reactions. That means limited means that they're limited in time and they're limited in scope, in severity. Beyond 7 days after vaccination, they saw very few serious adverse events. And the main thing that pops up after 7 days is that up to 4% of the people showed severe fatigue. Severe fatigue means you're just really moping around. You don't feel well. Doesn't mean you're bedridden or nothing or something like that. You just feel fatigued. That's a little high in the vaccine world, but it's not something that is of great concern. Let's look at these events, these local reactions and systemic reactions that occur in the first 7 days after vaccination, and ask the question, well, what can I expect to see? What's the probability of having one of these? So pain of an injection site is seen in both the Moderna and the Pfizer mRNA vaccine in about 60 to 70% of the people who were vaccinated in the clinical trial. About 8% of people who had a placebo, that would be just a 0.5 milliliter of saline injection, saw it as well, probably just from the needle stick. About 10% had redness, about 10% had swelling, about 50% in the one study that tested for it showed some decreased arm movement, that sore arm that you get after a vaccine. About 60% had the systemic reaction of fatigue, a little high compared to other vaccines, a little on the high side. So these RNA vaccines that are on the market now that we're most likely to receive are fatiguing people a little bit, usually for a day, maybe 2 days at the most, very rarely beyond 7 days. Headache is seen in quite a few people. Well, if you've got pain at the injection site and you've got fatigue, it's quite possible you're going to have a headache. Same with muscle pain. If you have muscle pain, you might have a headache too. Joint pain, 20% of people, 10 to 20% with a little bit of GI upset that often goes with fever and fatigue and headache. And a few people with fever, 10%, and maybe 20 to 40% of people show chills. So to people who are experienced in vaccine clinical trials, as we'll show in a later slide, this is pretty typical of a vaccine. So with that, we think that the Pfizer vaccine has a pretty typical profile of short-lived, not serious, but mild to mildly moderate local reactions and systemic reactions. Pfizer tested 36,000 of these participants and found they had very high titers of these neutralizing antibodies. So high that I was shocked when I saw them. It said that this vaccine is likely to be protective. And sure enough, when they looked at the protective efficacy, it was 95%, as high as any vaccine that I know of. There are only 2 vaccines that I know of that reached 95% in the past. One is the measles vaccine, which is known as an excellent vaccine, and the new shingles vaccine that came out about 5 years ago. And you can see the numbers, 8 cases in the vaccinated group, 162. The other thing that came out of this was that there was only 50% efficacy after a single or a first dose. Now, 50% is not great, it's not bad. To give you a reference, a typical person who gets influenza vaccine will receive 52% efficacy. The main outcome with the Pfizer and again with the Moderna vaccine is it works across populations by age, race, gender, ethnicity, and predisposition. This is very unusual for a vaccine to work across a broad spectrum of people. And these vaccines were used in a broad spectrum of people, predisposing conditions of various types, racial and ethnic groups, and so forth. What about the Moderna vaccine? They did 30,000 participants. Their dose is a little bit higher in micrograms, but the same volume, about 10 drops. The reactions were, local reactions were seen in 84% of the people, a little bit higher than the Pfizer vaccine, but quite honestly, it's probably not a significant difference. They saw a higher number of reactions in the placebo. The local reactions were typically 1 to 2 days, and delayed reactions, meaning reactions that might have occurred after 7 days, were seen in about 1% of the people. The body-wide reactions, the systemic reactions, were seen in 79%. That doesn't mean that 79% of people had every one of them. It means that 79% of the people had at least one. The adverse events, that is things that were unexpected and seen after 7 days, were 8%, but the placebo group had half that many. The grade 3 adverse events, these are serious adverse events, were seen in 1.5%, but the placebo group had an equal number, which means serious adverse events or moderate adverse events are very rare. One thing that was noted were hypersensitivity reactions. They occurred, but they were low and comparable to the placebo group. And something called Bell's palsy. In adults, this is a temporary nerve disorder that's often seen in the cheek area. And there may have been higher in the vaccines, but right now the scientists disagree. Most scientists don't think that it is an actual adverse event from the vaccine. Let's ask the question, how do these Moderna and Pfizer vaccines compare to vaccines that I might know? So on the left-hand side of this, you'll see the reactions, the local and limited reactions we talked about, and then the Moderna and Pfizer, the percentages we saw before. On the right-hand side, we see 3 vaccines and the reactions to those vaccines, and we're familiar with these vaccines. Most of us have gotten one or more of these vaccines. Prevnar, that pneumococcal vaccine that your physician probably wanted you to get a few years ago. Shingles, that really new improved shingles vaccine that has 95% efficacy. And Fluzone, that high dose flu vaccine that's recommended for seniors every year. And we see that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine fall into the same percentage ranges for each of these reactions. And so the conclusion from vaccine experts today is, boy, these Moderna vaccines have a safety profile that's right in line and a reactivity profile that's right in line with what we've seen. Interestingly, seniors always, with all of these vaccines, seem to have a lower reactivity index, a lower percentage than younger people. And I don't know if it's because seniors can tolerate more or they don't gripe as much or what it is, but we're in a group in an age group in which these numbers are lower than they are in the general population for reactions. How did the Moderna vaccine do as far as neutralizing antibody and efficacy? Neutralizing antibody responses had the same kind of high titers. So we expect the Moderna vaccine to protect, and sure enough, had 95% again, protective efficacy. And they noted also with the Moderna vaccine that against severe COVID-19 disease, it was 100% protective. I don't know what those comparable results were for the Pfizer vaccine, but I think they were pretty close to that. And the final finding from the Moderna vaccine and in any other vaccine to date, except one we'll talk about in a minute, is we don't know if these produce sterilizing immunity. With this protective efficacy and neutralizing antibody, we expect there to be sterilizing immunity. Sterilizing immunity is the situation in which your immune response to the virus is so good that you don't even get a slight infection. You don't even get an asymptomatic infection. That's the ultimate goal for all vaccines. Not a lot of vaccines produce sterilizing immunity completely, 100%. True sterilizing immunity means you will never transmit that vaccine. Partial sterilizing or near sterilizing means you will greatly reduce transmission. Most vaccines do reach that level. We don't know today what the transmission rate is going to be amongst people who have been vaccinated. We expect the transmission rate of vaccinated people to be very low. Theoretical risks. Any new vaccine has theoretical risks, and you really have to take these into consideration. Typically, we don't vaccinate and give vaccines, or we don't license and give vaccines to the general public until about a year after the clinical trials are done. Because of the urgency, the need for this vaccine, and since the efficacy is so high, it went to the general public almost as soon as the clinical trials were over. There hasn't been a lot of follow-up in those 43 or 30,000 people to see if other issues, other risks arise. What are they? What are those risks? They're unexpected reactions. And we've seen one, which is called allergic response to the vaccine. We didn't see that very much in the clinical trials. Now that we've followed a number of people, we're starting to see that. There could be other unexpected reactions, but these are typically very rare and in only a small percentage of vaccines when they do arise. There could be an issue with a batch or a vial of vaccine. They could be safety issues. Generally, these things are related to a single vial or a single batch of vials. There could be efficacy issues, and that's on our mind now. There could be decreased potency because a new variant comes in, or our antibody responses could drop off over time, and a year from now, we might not be protected. We just don't know how long our antibody responses are going to last. And there could be quality issues again with a particular vial, sterility, contaminants, precipitation, or just really weird events like a pharmacist in Milwaukee who believes the world is flat, takes a bunch of vials out of the freezer, lets them warm up for a long time, and then maybe if he hadn't been caught would put them back in the freezer and we'd never know it. Other possible and theoretical issues is one vaccine vastly better than another? Was dose number 2 delayed? What happens if we don't get our dose at 3 or 4 or 5 weeks after our first dose. Will vaccines be effective against any or all emergent strains? These are theoretical risks with new vaccines. The risks are very low with any given vaccine, but they're theoretical. Talk finally about the adenovirus vaccine. Adenovirus is a virus that we've all had. We've all probably been infected with it. Adenoviruses are usually not a problem. That is, they don't cause severe disease except in big outbreaks and things like military barracks. So if you were ever in the military, you were definitely vaccinated with an adenovirus that prevents human adenovirus infections. So there's two vaccines that are coming down the pipeline. One of them will probably be get FDA approval later this month, and we'll talk about that depend on an adenovirus that cannot infect us, but it can enter our cells. And this is a genetically engineered adenovirus. It's shown by the blue particles on the left. And the DNA from the coronavirus, knobs on the surface of the coronavirus, are put into this adenovirus. That adenovirus, when it's injected into our muscles, enters our cells and it dies. But before it dies, our cells use that adenovirus, the DNA that adenovirus is carried in, to elicit an immune response and produce these neutralizing antibodies. This is an old technique that's been used, the genetically engineered adenoviruses, for some time. So 2 vaccines, one that'll probably be available by the end of February. Johnson & Johnson's adenovirus has shown 72% efficacy. These are initial results. Unlike the RNA vaccines, these have not been published or peer reviewed yet, but we're pretty sure that these are solid results. 72% effective, 85% effective against severe disease. They give very high neutralizing antibody responses. The reported reactivity it was in the expected amount. That is what we see with the other vaccines and with the other coronavirus vaccines. It has a real advantage, and it can be easily manufactured, stored, and transported all in just refrigerators without freezers. I expect that FDA will approve this vaccine again pretty soon. It's unlikely that it will be available to us in probably before April at the earliest. It could be May. Another one is the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It's an adenovirus-vectored vaccine. It's live, but it dies within your cells. It doesn't replicate in humans. This was supposed to have finished in midwinter. I don't expect this vaccine will be on the market for some time because they've had some odd results in the efficacy in the clinical trials. You can see those numbers there. They get 76, 62, 90% of efficacy. These are a little confusing. It had to do with the design of their clinical trial. I expect that they're going to have to extend their clinical trials in the United States for a while. I'll bet you won't see this on the market. Other candidate vaccines, Novavax is coming out with a vaccine. It's quite promising, and I think we'll probably see it on the market sometime, but I bet it's not going to be till late spring or early summer. Sanofi Pasteur and Glaxo might have one late this year. And then there are 3 vaccines from overseas, Russia, China, and India. I doubt if we'll ever see those in the United States. I think those will be used in other countries, certainly in those countries, and perhaps in other countries. But I think we'll have so many vaccines in the market by summertime in the United States that these vaccines won't be able to compete in the United States. I think we'll have a pretty adequate supply come spring or summer in our own country. Two things I want to talk about are the risks of allergic responses or anaphylaxis. So we're in a period now in which issues are popping up, and we're seeing people in the press, in the media, who are going, oh my gosh, this is a terrible issue. This is a huge issue. And then it kind of goes away. And the two that I want to talk about, two of these. One came up in late January, the risk of allergic responses. We had seen very few allergic responses in the clinical trials, and those allergic responses seemed to be random. In other words, they occurred in equal numbers in the placebo and in the vaccinated group. But once we got to 4 million vaccinees around mid-January in the United States, we said, whoa, maybe people can be allergic to this vaccine. What are the numbers? And so the Center for Disease Control put out the numbers. In 4 million people, there were 108 allergic or anaphylactic reactions. Those were 27 in a million people had an allergic reaction. Of those 108, 98%, the vast majority, were allergic reactions, not anaphylactic reactions. There's a big difference. An allergic reaction is the kind of thing we have to pollen, or when we get a skin rash after we become allergic to a drug. They're not life-threatening. They're the kind of thing you might take an anti-allergy medication for, or something like that. However, 10 of those 108 are anaphylaxis. Those are life-threatening reactions. Those are not good. In 9 of the 10 people, they had a previous history of allergies or allergic anaphylactic reactions. So out of 4 million people, there were 10 anaphylactic reactions, and 51% of the total of the 108 showed an onset within 15 minutes of vaccination. 73% had an onset within 30 minutes. What does that tell us? That tells us that the vaccine is in some people causing allergic and even anaphylactic reactions. Tells me something that if I get vaccinated, I am going to stick around that clinic for at least 15 minutes, no matter what my allergy or anaphylactic history is. I'm going to stick around that clinic because I know that clinic is going to be able to treat an allergic or, in the worst case, an anaphylactic reaction. I know I'm probably not going to drive my car for 30 minutes after I leave that, because I don't want to have an anaphylactic reaction when I'm driving down the Beltway after I've been vaccinated. This is a low rate. I mean, if you look at the rate of anaphylactic reactions to anything, such as bee stings and bites and things like that, you'll find that this is a very low rate, but it's probably real. So looking at the bottom, the allergic reactions are 27 in a million. Anaphylactic reactions are 1.3 to any vaccine. And anaphylactic reactions to the COVID are about 2.5. There's probably not a significant difference between these two numbers. It's going to be hard to say once we've have the results on 10 or 20 million people exactly where that number is. But compare that to the risk of death when infected with COVID-19. So if you're infected, you have a 1.7% risk of death, or infection with COVID-19, which is 82,001 million. The second thing that's come up even more recently, in just the last 2 weeks, is we're seeing what are called variants of COVID-19 arising in different parts of the world. RNA vaccines, or RNA viruses, excuse me, undergo a lot of mutation. There are hypermutating organisms in our world, much more mutation than we see in our cells or even in DNA vaccines. A mutation in an RNA virus can be deleterious to the virus. That means that it won't go anywhere. It can be neutral, that is, not affect the virus in any way, or it can be favorable. COVID-19 variants have been seen now in the UK, Brazil, and South Africa. There are various attributes to a mutation. It can make the vaccine more transmit easier between people, that is, become more infectious. And it may or may not affect a particular age group or show a particular disease in the host. And it can also make the virus evade our immune responses. And those are the things that we worry about. Right now, we know that these variants can transmit a little bit better. They compete for the host quite a bit better in an evolutionary or in a biological sense. And there's a hint that they may evade natural immunity, and therefore they could evade some of the immunity we develop from vaccines. That's the big risk. I think that the possible outcomes for a variant are going to be that it could dominate, it could recede. We've seen SARS-1 and MERS coronavirus just recede into the background. They were variants from other coronaviruses, and they just didn't make it in this world. They had a few headlines for a few weeks, but then they just sort of disappeared. That can happen. And they may be controlled by a vaccine, or they may not be controlled. There's some data that's come out in the last few days that say that the Novavax and the J&J and the Oxford vaccine may not provide full immunity. However, these are very preliminary data. I don't know if they should have ever been reported outside of the scientific community. And we asked the question, well, what is full immunity? And also the designs of the trials were not meant to look at variants. And so we have to ask the question, are these complete results? And the answer is, no, these are incomplete. What's needed are adequate clinical trials to determine if the variants are really a threat, and something that's already being worked on, vaccines to the variants. My personal opinion is that this variant, the worst case situation to this variant question is going to be that someday we may be getting a booster vaccine to the variants, and someday we might even be getting an annual vaccine booster to coronavirus, just as we do with influenza virus. So I don't think they're a huge threat, but they're certainly worth paying attention to. And it's good that people are currently conducting clinical trials to see what the threat of the variants is, and they're developing vaccines to these variant organisms. So the last few slides I have and the last discussion pieces have to do with your deciding, making that personal decision in which you weigh the risks to the benefits of this vaccine and ask yourself the question, am I going to get the vaccine? Do the benefits outweigh the risks, or do the risks outweigh the benefits? Fortunately, a lot of deliberate bodies of experts have already kind of cleared the ground a little bit and helped us make it easier. And when they cleared the ground, when all these experts have met, and I'll go through the list in a second, these experts did not ask whether people should get the vaccine. They only asked the question, do the benefits outweigh the risks to the point where we should offer the vaccine to people and let them decide whether to take it themselves? So in the list on the right, you see that this was analyzed, the benefit to risk was analyzed by the sponsor, the manufacturer, the developer, first as they were developing it, during the process, and then before they went to FDA. And then FDA Expert Advisory Committee asked the same question. The Food and Drug Administration went through the process as well. And then our Committee on Immunization Practices went through the same process. And of course, these medical and public health professionals that you've heard speak on television and in the press, they also have expressed their opinion. And there have been some watchdog organizations. Some have been more critical than others, but for the most part, all of these groups have agreed that the benefits outweigh the risk. But the real deciding person is when you ask yourself, am I going to get this vaccine after you've weighed the benefits and the risk? We do risk-benefit analysis every day. We do it when we get to a stop sign. Should I just go slowly through this stop sign? And you very quickly, without even thinking about it, decide, there's a lot of traffic today, or I think maybe that's a policeman down the street. I'm going to come to a full and complete stop. Or you may say, I really need to get to where I'm going. I'm already late. I don't see any traffic, and so I'm not going to come to a full stop today. There's also thoughtful decisions, and that's kind of where I'm coming from as far as measuring benefits to risk for these COVID vaccines. So let's go through 4 slides. What are the risks of not vaccinating? The risk of infection is high. There have been 27 million infections in the United States. There's a slight pause right now. We're going downhill in the number of new infections every day, but we've seen this happen twice already this year. We've gone downhill and then we immediately start uphill again. And each peak is higher than the last peak. We've had almost 500,000 deaths. There's a risk of moderate or severe disease. There's a risk of transmitting the COVID to family and friends. There's exposure to infections with new strains. There's economic risks. There's the risk of having to continue to wear masks and isolate for the foreseeable future. And there's just the stress. Will I be? What might be the outcome? Benefits of not vaccinating. I can guarantee you, if you don't get the vaccine, you will have no reactions to the vaccine. There will be no adverse events, and you'll avoid any inconveniences associated with vaccination and any discomforts. What are the risks of vaccination? We've been through these and we've seen the numbers. They're discomforts. Needle stick twice. 1 or more mild to moderate limited duration. Most people who get vaccinated are going to have 1 or more local or systemic reactions. Medical, there's this allergic reaction. 27 out of 4 million, or 108 out of 4 million people had some type of a reaction. And 10 of those were anaphylactic reactions, although we know that people with a history of anaphylaxis are higher. There's the unknowns that we went through. There's the vaccine quality issues that we just are still an unknown because they only affect particular lots in particular situations. And even though they're rare, they exist. There's that decline in potency or efficacy in variant strains. And there's false alarms on vaccine efficacy or safety. We'll start seeing very soon a lot of false alarms. And that does not mean they're conspiracy theories. They're just false alarms that come out to the public. And there's personal inconveniences. You got to drive to the vaccine site twice. What are the benefits of vaccination? I see those in two ways. There's personal medical, and there's what I call altruistic. Personal medical, you're going to be significantly less likely to become infected and thus seriously ill or become a long-termer. One of those people who has these weird symptoms and disease things that last for a long time. You're going to be less likely to be exposed to reactions. The protective efficacy is good. We found to date, no matter my age, gender, race, ethnicity, or in many cases with predisposing conditions, possibly provides immunity and protection for emerging strains. If emerging strains do come into the United States, and I think they are right now, people who are vaccinated are going to have much lower risk than people who are not vaccinated. The story of vaccines is very clear that they do work against most emerging strains. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, immunity to one strain confers at least partial protection to other strains. Less likely to inconvenience yourself, your friends, your family if you get sick or if you can't be around them for a while. No cost of vaccination for most of us. And it reduces personal and family stress. You can hug the grandkids again. What are the altruistic benefits? We all take drugs, and we know that drugs seldom benefit anybody but the person taking the drug, me. Take an antihypertensive, take an antiviral, take almost any drug, and the person that's going to benefit is me, and it is not likely that it's going to benefit anybody else. Vaccines are totally different, and I think we forget that a benefit of vaccines is that they benefit society. We're less likely to transmit and infect family, friends, and healthcare workers if we are vaccinated versus if we're not. It decreases the emergence of variants. Variants are arising for the simple reason that virus is out there just multiplying like crazy in people during a pandemic. Variants arise when viruses multiply, and they're propagated when those viruses are transmitted. If we decrease transmission, if we decrease infection, we're going to decrease the emergence of variants and solve that problem as well. That's been shown time and again with vaccines. We benefit society as a participant in termination of a pandemic. We add to societal trust, relief, reduced tension within a society. Wouldn't it be nice if the first grader's dream came true? And there's finally a personal benefit, an altruistic personal benefit, and that is a helper's high. That's how people feel after they've donated blood to the Red Cross. They didn't get paid for the blood. All they're going to get is a stale cookie and a cup of tea. However, they really feel good about what they've done. Finally, when I was talking to a friend of mine, she and I are college buddies, and we were talking a few months ago about this, and we got into comparing this to the 1918 influenza pandemic. And she told me about her family. Her family had been hugely impacted by this. Her grandfather, paternal grandfather, had died in 1918 of influenza. And about the same time, her father's sibling had died, as well as a nearby cousin. There were farm families in Southwest Wisconsin, and it devastated the family. And her father carried that through life with him. He didn't have a father to raise him. The mother lost the farm. The kids all dispersed. They didn't know each other. They more or less became semi-orphans because the mother couldn't raise all these kids without a farm, and so forth. And it raised the question that she asked. She said, if influenza vaccination had been available to our parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents during that pandemic, would they, their friends or neighbors or coworkers, have chosen vaccination? And she kind of went beyond. And if they had a vaccine then, and we didn't have influenza vaccines until the 30s, and they weren't widely used until the late 40s, but if we had then, how would that have affected her family and the Society of Farmers in Southwest Wisconsin at the time? And I thought that was a pretty good question. Final slide, reliable sources of information. Watch out what you read and what you listen to. Mayo Clinic is by far the best website if you ever have a question about a medication or a disease or anything like that. I've taught that for years. You just go to Mayo. They're great. Their information is great. For COVID and COVID vaccines and this whole COVID, CDC is great, and they do gear their website to both professionals and non-professionals in the medical field. It's just loaded with good information. It's a little harder to search than Mayo, but it's good. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, you want to find out all the latest information that's been presented by one of these vaccine companies to FDA, go to fda.gov. They do have some general consumer information too. If you really want great information, some of the best reviews on the subject of COVID and COVID vaccines are in Science and Nature magazines, which are at some libraries. And you can go to the New England Journal of Medicine or Journal of the American Medical Association for additional information. Some of it's a bit technical, but the abstracts are quite readable. And you can even subscribe to get the table of contents from which you can get the abstracts for free by subscribing as a registrant, not a paid subscriber. Reliable scientists, as I mentioned, there are some scientists out there that are, I don't know, they're not misleading us, but they get pretty excited when they get on TV and say the world's coming to an end and the sky is falling down and we have a new problem and so forth. For those of you who have questions about things like allergies, should I get the vaccine because I'm an allergic? Go to CDC website or ask your physician. CDC website now recommends who should talk to their physician and who shouldn't. They have a nice one-page description of, should I talk to my physician if I am hyperallergic or something? And Bob Shaw posted the last 5 slides, including this one, at the PLATO website. With that, I'll turn it back to Joy and see if we have any questions.
We do have a number of questions. So yes, we'll try to get to as many as possible. If you have one, you can type it in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And let me just go through these as quickly as I can. One attendee asks, why are the authorizations just for emergency use? Do they subsequently expire or get converted to regular use? Should we wait for a safer non-emergency okay?
In some ways, I covered that in the talk. The emergency use has never been used with vaccines before. It was developed for situations like this. It's not full authorization. The emergency use was given as what I'd call an abbreviated or even temporary authorization for 2 reasons. One is we had really good results from the clinical trial, low risk, high benefit. And the clinical trials were really well done. They were exceptional, and you've seen the results. They were large, they were well done. And there was just a huge need to get the vaccines to people because we needed to try vaccination as a way to end this pandemic and save lives. So there was a trade-off and there was a risk-benefit done by FDA. The reason that it was only emergency use is because we didn't have this 1 or 2 years of follow-up, and there were possible, unlikely, but possible unknown risks that we would have picked up in the time that we would have had a year to 2 years between the time the clinical trial ended and the time we would have given a full authorization. So yeah, there is risk, but I think all the experts agree that the clinical trials were so good, the picture is so good, and the need is so urgent that EUA was the way to go.
Charles wonders, could you address this interesting issue within the UK regarding the postponement of the second of the vaccine, perhaps as many as 12 weeks after the first dose, in order to dispense more of the first doses to the most number of people as soon as possible?
Yeah, very controversial thing. We know from other vaccines that you can wait some time to get your second dose, and you will still get a really great immune response, a great boost to that second dose, even if you wait 12 weeks or so. However, we've seen the risk in the data, and that is you're only 52% protected. I have no personal feeling one way or another. It's a really hard call. I defer this to Tony Fauci, who I hugely respect. And I'll bet you he would defer too. And as a matter of fact, from what I've heard from him about this. So I don't know if it's a good decision or not. Time will tell. It really weighs the risk of having people out there with only 52% protection versus the risk of having people out there, a certain number of people out there with no protection. It's a tough call.
Lynn wonders if there is an impact of getting the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine a few days late, 24 instead of 21, or is there any evidence that if you get it later than usual, it's a problem?
No, and there's probably no other vaccine precedent would tell us there isn't a whole lot of impact if we waited and even until 12 weeks. other than the fact that you only have partial protection from that in that period that you delay, that you don't have as high a protection. With most vaccines, and I think with the COVID as well, you are at your peak protection about 7 to 21 days after your second dose. That's the real sweet spot. If you're going to run into COVID, do it between 7 and 21 days after your second dose.
We have a couple of people who asked the question as to whether it's true after having the vaccine, we should not use aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol because that might affect our immune system or somehow decrease the efficacy of the vaccine.
Yeah, the age-old question with vaccines, I've run into that a zillion times, including with my subjects that participated in my clinical trials. There's no good answer to that. It's a debate. It's an age-old debated question. I would go to CDC. I'm trying to think what I saw in CDC, and I think they said, hey, if you got inflammation, you got a headache, take Tylenol. Tylenol is generally the recommended one, though. I don't know about other NSAIDs, but whenever I see an answer to that, and they say just take something and relieve the pain and discomfort, it's Tylenol.
Is it true if you don't get the second vaccine, it may allow the virus to mutate?
Mutation in these RNA viruses is driven by replication and transmission. In other words, the probability of a variant arising just comes from the amount of virus that's out there and is replicating and is being transmitted. You don't mutate the virus, and you don't cause recombinant events by anything you do, really.
Right, this one is a little complicated for me, so I hope I don't mess it up. What is the clinical difference, efficacy, toxicity between a mRNA versus an adenovirus, one that's more studied? The difference between those two.
Yeah, so the question says is the mRNA vaccine better than these adenovirus vaccines that are coming down? So for most of us, we don't have to worry about that because the adenovirus vaccines won't be available to us for some time. So if we're about to make an immediate decision, or if we've already made a decision, that it doesn't come into play very much. The adenoviruses are showing a slightly decrease below the mRNA virus, mRNA vaccines in efficacy. So the mRNA are about 95% efficacy, and the adeno are slightly lower in percent, somewhere between 70 and 85%, I'd say, depending on how you measure efficacy. That depending on how you measure efficacy is the big thing. 2 years from now, I may say that having vaccinated 180 million people in the United States, we now know that the adeno were actually better than the mRNA. And that's because those numbers are based on clinical trials in 20, 30,000, 40,000 people. And all of the factors such as variants and things like that, we just don't know yet. If I were given...
How long after the... I'm sorry.
What?
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought
If
you
I were
finished.
given a choice, if I decided to be vaccinated, and right now knowing the data, remember the data on the adeno-vectored vaccines is not been published or peer reviewed, but what I know of preliminary data on those versus the scientifically examined data on the mRNA, if I were to walk in and they'd say, what do you want, one or the other, I'd say whatever you reach for first. Efficacy, when you get into efficacies above 75%, it's really hard to decide. You know, mumps vaccine has a 70% efficacy. Measles vaccine has a 95% efficacy. And you know what? They both work equally well against the disease they were designed to prevent.
A couple of people asked about how long after the second vaccine are you then 95% protected?
You're going to be at your peak immunity 7 to 21 days after your and that is going to, we don't know how long that's going to last. And that goes back to that, why are we just at EUA? Because we don't know how long. That's one of the reasons we're just at EU. That's an unknown. We don't know how long this is going to last. And I personally, as you saw, I gave very few personal predictions, but I think we're going to be getting, or we're going to be recommended that we get an annual coronavirus boost someday.
Will it be safe for someone's 87-year-old mother to return to Florida by plane after she has had 2 doses of the vaccine? She wants to get back to her life.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a personal decision. All I can do is go with the numbers. I want to get back to my personal life, and so does that first grader in Verona.
Right.
I don't know. Let me comment on that. We're all going to have decisions to make. Those of us who get vaccinated and those of us who don't get vaccinated are going to have some big decisions, both as a society. At what point are we going to take off our masks? At what point are we going to stand 2 feet behind somebody in a grocery store? At what point is Tony Fauci going to say, take off the masks and quit distancing? It's going to be interesting to watch.
We're almost completely out of time, but when can we reach herd immunity? What does herd immunity mean?
Herd immunity for COVID has been defined by the experts as reaching 70% immunity. So 70% of us in our country or in the world, depending on how you look at it, if you travel a lot, it's in the world, 70% have immunity that prevents disease and hopefully reduces significantly transmission by me to somebody else. I think it's going to be a little bit higher. We reached herd immunity with measles at about 90%. We think it's going to be much lower with malaria. So I've heard the debate. Some say 60, some say 70, some say 80. I'm an 80% guy.
We'll leave it there because we are out of time. Mike, thank you so much for a very informative, very accessible lecture on what we need to know about coronavirus vaccines. And there is more information posted on the PLATO website, so you can check out the costs and benefits handout that Mike provided us. And thanks to all of you for attending. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's question. Obviously, a lot of interest in this. You can join us next time, next Thursday. We will be presenting Madison College's role in promoting social justice in the community. That will be on February 18th, starting at 1:30. Our guest is Dr. Jack Daniels, who is the head of Madison College. Hope to see you then. Thanks.
Thank you.